Hey Ray, I totally loved the video that you did, giving your outline for the Sermon on the Mount. That was so good. So I know you asked me at the end of that video to kind of give my thoughts on what it means to be when Jesus says, "Blessed is the poor in spirit," and I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that in a video I'll record after this. But honestly, I was inspired by your video, and I thought, man, I want to share an outline too. So real quickly in this video, I'll just share with you my kind of outline, the way I would outline the Sermon on the Mount. So again, the title, I would call it "Living in Light of the Age to Come," and the first part of the Sermon on the Mount would be. Let me put up here. I got an outline. By the way, those of you watching, I encourage you to check out Ray's video where he does the outline. It's super helpful when you're studying the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew 5, Matthew 6, and Matthew 7. So here would be probably the way I'd outline the Sermon on the Mount. I'd probably do Matthew 5, verses 3 through 16. I'd call that like the introduction or the preamble to the sermon that Jesus gives. Of course, that's the Beatitudes. And then he talks about how we are, those who follow him are salt and they are light. And I think that's like, I see that as like kind of introduction and preamble. And really everything else that follows in this Sermon on the Mount is building upon what he sets forth in those 8 Beatitudes. And so I would say that as introduction. And then I see Matthew 5, verse 17, all the way through chapter 7, verse 12, as just practical explanations of what true righteousness looks like from God's perspective. So I think in the Beatitudes, in the introduction of the sermon, verses 3 through 16, Jesus is making the point that righteousness starts on the inside and then it should be shining through on the outside. But it starts on the inside and then shines through on the outside. And then following up on that, I think he's now just breaking that down for us practically. And he's like, well, I'm giving you a bunch of practical examples of what I mean. This is what true righteousness looks like from God's perspective. And so I'd say the first part of that, chapter 5, 17 through 48, is basically, I would say obey God's commands is what he's saying. True righteousness, we have to obey God's commands. And he gives lots of different examples of that in the area of, like anger, lust, marriage, etc. And then he says this chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 7, verse 12, I would say obey God with right motives. So this is what true righteousness looks like. And first, he's like, you got to obey God's commands, and he gives some examples. And then he says, I would say this, you probably better would be obey God's commands from the inside out. And then the second part is true righteousness looks like obeying God's commands from the inside out. And then second, obeying God with right motives. And so in chapter 6, 1 through 23, it's the motive of we aim to please God rather than just impress people. And then the second pure motive he talks about is without covetousness and with full confidence in God's provision. So that's in chapter 6, 24 through 34. And then the third motive he talks about, right motive, is obeying God with a merciful heart rather than a critical spirit. And that's in chapter 7, verses 1 through 12. And because honestly, when you're really going hard after the Lord and you're truly just seeking to honor God, like in the motives of your heart and in your thought life and in the words that you speak and in the way that you're living, sometimes it can be easy to become critical of others that we would judge that aren't going after God in the same way. And I think Jesus in chapter 7, verses 1 through 12, we'll break it down later in this playlist, is just warning against that. He's like, no, we got to have a merciful spirit as we pursue wholehearted obedience to God. And then finally, the end of the Sermon on the Mount, I would say, is chapter 7, verse 13 through 27. I think that whole section is the conclusion of Jesus' sermon. So, in the same way that the introduction is 5, 3 through 16, 7, 13 through 27 is concluding exhortations that Jesus gives, where he says, hey, this teaching I just gave you in the Sermon on the Mount of living a righteous life, this is the narrow way, and it's the only way to enter the kingdom of God. And there are a few who find it. And then he warns against false teachers and false prophets who would try and seduce people into a way of living that is that ignores Jesus' exhortations in the Sermon on the Mount, and that steers people away from true righteousness into something different. And then he says, you got to look, you'll know them by their fruit. And then finally, he gives a parable at the very end where he talks about those who build on the rock, those who build their lives on the sand. And the wise are those who hear his teachings in the Sermon on the Mount specifically and put them into practice. He's like, those are wise people, and they're building their life on a solid foundation. So that's my thoughts, my outline of the Sermon on the Mount. Thank you so much for sharing yours. I really enjoyed that. I loved it. And it just got my mind stirring. And I'm like, oh, this is fun. So I decided to just do my own and share it with you as well. So for, those of you who are watching this, I just encourage you, I would love to hear, what are your thoughts? What would if you were to outline the Sermon on the Mount, what would your outline be? And you could just share that in the comment section below. If you have any questions, share that in the comment section below. Ray, I loved, this was new thought for me. When you outlined in your video, you talked about how the whole book of Matthew is in 5 sections, and each of the 5 sections concludes with a teaching from Jesus. And I've never heard that before. I thought that was so cool. So I'm kind of, I'm looking forward to, I want to be able to actually read Matthew with that in mind and just kind of read it through that lens. So thanks for sharing your thoughts. I'll do in the next video, I'll talk about blessed are the poor in spirit. But guys, I want to ask you to do 3 things for those of you watching right now. If you could, before you do anything else, hit pause and then subscribe to the 5 State Revival YouTube channel. I think we have like 248 subscribers now. Like, I would love to bump this thing up today to over 250, and head toward that 300 mark. Then if you could share this, like the video and share it on your social media so we can help spread the word, and others can get access to this content too. And then the third thing is study the Sermon on the Mount and start a discipleship group. Start meeting with others and reading through the Sermon on the Mount and studying it together. And that'd be a great way to grow in the Lord. So God bless you guys.